This is the Podcasting for Podcast. Podcasting for communities, podcasting for student journalists, podcasting for business, podcasting for anyone. It's the starter's guide to podcasting and community radio production. You can subscribe and download from iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn and Libsyn. These podcasts, the book and the blog focus on 5 radio skills: writing, reading, interviewing, recording and editing. And in this episode, I interview an interviewer. As an anchor on the BBC News Channel, Maxine Mawhinney probably spends more time interviewing than anything else. The interviewees will be in the studio or remote somewhere else in the country or really anywhere in the world, sometimes in a different studio or on Skype or on a phone. She'll talk to correspondents, reporters, eyewitnesses, politicians, business people, anyone. And because of the very nature of news, Maxine might not get much notice about who she's going to quiz or time to plan what she's going to ask. We began talking about what happens during a typical shift.
I'm on air for 5 hours by myself live, and that's a very long time. I do get some breaks for little programmes. So I will come in, if I'm on air at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I'm in by about 10 o'clock because I have to prep for everything that I'm doing. And then, of course, because it's TV, you have to go to makeup as well. You would not want us on TV without makeup. But I take my notes when I'm down there too and read through them. So I get a sheet of, say, 2 or 3 A4 pages, both sides, with lists of stories. So those are all the stories of the day in order of importance and what we might be covering. So if there's something set up for a live with a reporter, that will be on there. I'll know roughly the first couple of guests or so. So we get a bit closer to the time, there'll be a meeting, and then I go on air. Now, once I'm on air, that's it. Like, it's just chaos, really, because normally when you sit down, you've got about the first 10 minutes of the running order on your computer. So therefore, you know what's happening in about the first 10 minutes of the programme. And then they start adding it in. It's done like a wheel in 15-minute segments with weather, top and bottom, and all of that sort of stuff. Quarter past headlines, quarter to headlines. So you're in all those little segments. It fluctuates. If they get a good interview, they'll let it run. Most interviews are about 3 minutes. So when you think about that, your 2 or 3 questions are really important. So get right in there with the big question. So we start off with the headlines. Most people join just before the headlines because they want the weather, and then they'll stay for the headlines. And if there's anything in there that tickles their fancy, they'll stay. The average time for a viewer is 12 minutes. So that's why we keep repeating, join us in a minute, or coming up shortly, or we'll tell you all about that in the sport. You're signposting to the audience that something is coming up that they might want to stay for. And then you go on through the hour, and obviously you've got to hit certain times in the hour. We've got sport and various other things. Now, in terms of how it's structured for me, so the headlines will all be on the auto cue. The cues to the packages will be on the auto cue. Everything else is not really. We do an awful lot of ad-libbing. So you use a lot of thinking on your feet. I also have 9 screens in front of me under the desk, under the glass desk that you can't see. It's a big screen cut into 9 grids, like a grid. And that's all the live stuff that's coming in. The other thing that we do a lot of is social media. So on the desk as well, in another screen, I have all the emails that are coming in, the tweets, the texts. And if we've got a big story coming up, we'll say, we're going to interview such and such in 20 minutes. If you've got a story for them, a question for them, would you like to ask them a question? And they're actually really useful for doing an interview and a biggish story, because most people don't like questions from real people, and we would use those. So in a way, that's how it works. It's a simple sort of wheel of an hour, and we just go through it. And for me, it's 5 times in the afternoon. They're constantly talking to me, of course, and telling me where we're going next and what's not happening, and things that haven't quite made it technically, etc., etc. And also they're wheeling guests in and out of the studio. And you do end up doing back-to-back interviews. So I'll do one from a remote location on the screen and turn around and do an interview on something else with a guest sitting beside me, sometimes 2 guests. This is more journalistically challenging because I do every story, not just the big story. So it's, for someone who's been around a while and maybe doesn't have the, the keenness to be on the road so much. This is fantastic.
Starting her career in a local newspaper, Maxine has worked in print, radio and TV. She has covered all sorts of stories, from court reports in the Bangor Spectator to high politics in the USA as Washington Correspondent for a national UK TV network.
Over that period of time, I would like to think I've become a better interviewer because of the experiences of all the previous interviews. In the early days, you get very nervous because you haven't really got the skills honed at that point, and you're thinking, what are they thinking of me, the interviewee? So what are they thinking of me? Am I going to ask the right questions, etc.? But actually, it's not all about you at all. It's about them. So as long as you approach the interview in the right way, you will get your interview. You'll get the best one you can. Now, what does that mean? Preparation, I'll probably keep saying that word, but you cannot prepare enough. I don't mean writing loads of questions or reading too much stuff. You have to sort of start at the end of the interview and decide, what is this interview about? Why am I interviewing this person? Where does it fit into the whole experience of the day on this story? Or is it a standalone interview? What type of interview is it? Is it informative? Is it aggressive? And by aggressive, I don't mean shouting. I mean, perhaps a politician who's being a bit difficult. So you have to really push. So you have to decide what it is and what you want from it. And the way I do that is I always think, if I wasn't a journalist, if I was watching or listening to this interview, what would I want to know? And I always make sure I don't leave the audience with what I would call puzzle news, i.e. unanswered questions. So bearing in mind you usually have a time limit as well, you have to make sure you get it all in. This can include various things like interrupting, which we can talk about later. But if you approach an interview by thinking, what do I want and how do I get there? You usually get there okay. I never write my questions down. I go on that thought and I think about what is the first question, what's the opening question? And that's where a lot of interviewers fall down because they sort of warm the guest up. Now for news, that can be good for something else if it's long form, but if it's news and you've maybe got 3 minutes or 4 minutes to get the best out of this interview, there's no point warming them up because you'll have lost a minute. So I usually go straight in with the main point. And it does sometimes shock the interviewee. By the way, I never tell them what the questions are. So that's how I approach it. The next thing is, as soon as they start answering, you've got to listen. I think listening is the biggest interviewing skill you can have because that's where you get the story. That's where you get the information. That's where you get the best from your interviewee. So it may be you ask the question that you want answered, you get an answer to it, but they say something else and it actually goes off in a slightly different tangent, but it's a better interview, if you know what I mean.
I know exactly what you mean, and it's the listening skill, the ability to hear what someone's saying rather than to think about the next question, which will lead the interview. But let's go back a little bit to the preparation, because you did want to talk about preparation. I think it's very important. And also that idea of not writing down the questions. Let's take both you and me, let's go way back in time to when we were first doing interviews and think about people who are going to do interviews for the first time now. The temptation is to sit down and write down 5 questions and by God you're going to ask them.
And also you're going to ask them in the order that you wrote them down in. It is the temptation. And actually, if it feels to you like a safety net, go ahead and do it. But please do not use it as a template because you will find that they'll say something and it will click in your brain. You think, oh, that's interesting, but I'm going to ask question 2 no matter what. And the interview goes really weird. And you can tell interviewees who are doing that if you listen to the interviews. They sort of ignore what the guest has said. But if it gives you a safety net, it's okay. However, I wouldn't write questions. What I would do is write bullet points or even one words, just a list of words, so that it covers all the areas of the interview that you want to cover. And then you've got that sort of security of knowing from this list, these are the areas I want to cover, and therefore I won't forget anything. Because that's actually one of the other things I think when you begin interviewing, you're worried about leaving something out. So if that helps you, that's fine. The other thing I think is really good when you first start out is I teach a lot of young journalists at the minute. And what people do, they seem to come to it cold. They'll think about what they're going to do, but they don't practice. You can practice with members of your family. You can practice with yourself on the computer. Just practice doing interviews about anything. Just to get your voice, how it sounds asking a question, so you're not afraid to ask a question. And that you're used to people talking to you back again. It's very different from having a conversation with someone when you're just sharing an event or whatever. It's very different because what you're actually trying to do is get them to give you that information. Now, most of your interviewees will be there because they want to give you that information.
Of course.
They're the informative interviews. It changes a bit when you've got the more difficult people like politicians or CEOs who are hiding something.
Somebody who is representing an organisation, a chief executive officer, who is going to want to promote the organisation, even though you have got information which will make life difficult for that CEO. And the politician who, I think John Humphrey said there are three types of politician: those who never lie, those who lie whenever they have to, and those who really don't care and they just lie all the time. So let's take this truth, non-truth sort of area where people do lie. So the chief executive will want to promote the organisation. So it might be a chief executive of a large organisation or a charity. But, that's his or her job. How do you deal with that when you know that's not actually the story?
This is where it comes down to preparation again. So you have to be really, really clear about your knowledge. How do I do that? I read a lot. I don't have teams of researchers giving me material. I get a list of what the stories are of the day, and I have to do it all myself. And how do I do that? I do it by a number of things. The BBC has the research and analysis, which is a really good tool for us to go through about what the background to a story is. Google, don't forget Google. Read a lot. I read everything, absolutely everything all the time. So I'm aware of what the main stories would be. And if I know I'm doing a specific story, I will, of course, focus on that. You have to be absolutely certain about your information. So if you're interviewing someone who's saying, oh, we're only going to make 100 people redundant and the plant's not going to close and this, and this, and you have a letter from the union saying they're making 500 people redundant, and you've got it in writing in front of you, you can use that. But what you can't do is say something vague like, well, I actually heard it was about 500, and you go, no, it's only 100. Yeah. So you have to be very careful with things like figures, money, numbers of people, that sort of stuff. If you go into an interview trying to wing it, you'll lose on that interview because they'll just walk all over you. But if you can come back with hard facts, that makes a really strong interview. And then you've almost got them on the ropes, and they'll continue to deny it, but you can just keep putting the facts to them. Let's just go right back to the beginning of the whole thing of journalism. I mean, when I started out and when you started out, Davey, it was, and I hope it's still the same, we are the person between the viewer or listener and the story. It's not our job to put our viewpoint in there. So in some ways that makes it actually very easy for the interviewer because you can step back from it. You're not taking a side in it, and you can look at it as an overview. The problem with that can come when you're doing one side of the story, so that the guest is on one particular side of the story, and you then become the voice of the other side of the story. So you would attribute it, so the other political party is accusing you of doing this. And sometimes when I do those interviews, people will say, why are you saying that? You're obviously biased. I said, I'm not saying it. This is what they are saying. But you're still the person in the middle, but sometimes you have to take that opposing view because otherwise otherwise it would just be a propaganda piece, really, wouldn't it, for the interviewee?
Okay, let's talk about interviewing people who you know well. How difficult can that be? Because as a journalist, you'll make friends. Some will be in politics, some will be in business, and someday some of them are going to be sitting in front of you and you're going to be asking them questions. How do you deal with that?
That is very true. So I divide this into a number of categories. If it's public body, politician, etc., I'm just completely straight. It's the way I approach all stories. I want the facts. I don't really care who's sitting in front of me. At that point, I'm not their friend and they're not my friend. So that's my job. And they know that. They know they're professionals. They know that. And I have to be honest, actually, no one has really tried to get away with anything. What they do, though, is because they're media trained to do it, is they'll come up at the top of the, I'll say, I'm introducing, Mr. Politician, and he'll come up and go, oh, good afternoon, Maxine. Now, I might never have met this person, or I might have met them, but they start off in that sort of chummy way. It doesn't work with me, to be honest, at all. Now, the other interviews are, say you have a charity interview or an interview about maybe an aid agency, that type of thing. Now, those, you want as much information and emotion from those types of interviews, in a way, because they're usually telling stories that are not very pleasant. If I know them, it doesn't really make any difference, apart from the fact I might know slightly more about the story because I might have talked to them about, how the difficulties they're having. So in that case, if that person doesn't say something, or I know they've forgotten something, you can prompt them by saying, well, what about, the difficulties of getting water to these people, or the difficulties of getting, beds for people who are sleeping on the streets, if they've forgotten it. Also, people representing some of those sectors can sometimes not be very familiar with radio or TV interviewing, and they go out there to represent the company, and they're very, very nervous.
Yes.
And, you can't let someone in that capacity die on air. So you would tend to ask them the questions so they really know what you're getting at, and then they can say, oh, yes, right, I'll talk about that now. Because from my point of view, I think that one of my jobs is to get the very best for my listener or my viewer. And if I don't do that, I've failed.
You've identified really two types of interviews. There's the challenging interview where you're asking somebody who doesn't want to answer you. There's the storytelling interview where you help someone tell the story. What other ones are there?
Well, there's a whole range of them, actually, and it depends what's happening. So say you've got a horrible atrocity happening somewhere, and the thing, of course, now with social media is you can almost speak to people as they're being bombed in their houses. So you get interviews with people who are in very traumatic situations. You get interviews with people who've just experienced something very traumatic. And those have to be handled with sensitivity and also respect, because those people are talking to you to describe the situation where they are. We would like that information because maybe we're not there. And it's really good to get the voice of the people rather than a journalist. But at the same time, you have to be very careful with people like that. You don't want to hold them on the phone or whatever, or Skype too long, so they might be in danger. You have to be careful about what they're saying, particularly if it's live. So you've got to be careful with your questioning on that. So those are prompting type of questions. And I need to explain here also, we don't take these people at random. They're always checked out before we put them live on air. But when we do interviews like that, I always think of a couple of things. So I'm not there. I can't see it. So I want to hear what's happening. I want to hear how they're feeling about it. And I also want them to describe what's around them. So I would frequently ask people to say, could you just look around and tell me what you can see?
Yes.
So it's very important that the viewer or listener is taken to that situation, because that's the whole point of it all, isn't it? You want the listener viewer to experience what is happening as much as possible. So it's also other things like, I remember interviewing someone who was near some huge forest fire in the United States. They were talking about this and that and the other, and they started coughing. And I said, what does it feel like? What's it like with the smoke? And they were explaining what the smoke felt like. And I said, and how does it smell? So we were able to think about the senses, hearing, smell, taste, all that sort of stuff, because that makes it very real for the audience. These techniques are they're sort of interchangeable between many interviews, but you have to just pull out the one that you want that suits that particular interview. It's going to get you a really good response. But you can see from that sort of scenario what you would get. It's really good. Now, the other one you were talking about, which is the more challenging one, I just want to talk about that for a second, because if you get someone who won't answer the question, or they're on message, so every time you ask them a question, they just say the key message. This tends to be a politician, or it tends to be someone at the scene of a commercial disaster where they're still trying to tackle the crisis of the whole thing and manage the media. So I had one recently. I'll not name names or anything, but the general premise was that it was a social issue, and I was interviewing the minister in charge. And I didn't know I was interviewing him until about 30 seconds before. So I thought, oh my goodness, what's this all about? So I'm reading the queue, thinking about what the hell am I going to ask him?
It's really good to know that the person who's doing this live on television gets 30 seconds notice, and you're wondering what to ask. I mean, that's really, for any new journalist, that's really good to know.
I tell you, it goes through your head, because you're reading something, the cue into it, and you're thinking, okay, right, they got him. They told me in my ear, you're going to interview him next because he's just popped up. And I was thinking, all right. So this is where the prep and the reading and the continually knowing your subject or if it's news, just basically knowing everything. So I thought, okay, I know what this issue is about because I'd read about it. So and the crux of it was to do with the social thing. It was to do with bins, actually. I'll just tell you that much.
All right.
And the bins are a big issue. So there was an issue with one collection of bins, and so the crux of it was, I thought, how much money are they going to save by changing the regularity of bin collections?
Okay.
So that was the first question. How much money are you going to save?
Uh-huh.
And his face was completely shocked, and he said, oh, well, Maxine, the issue here is not that. It's the environment and blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking, oh, for goodness sake. So I asked him it again. Oh, yeah, but how much are you going to save? Oh, this went on, honestly. So I think it must have been 5 or 6 times. Now, this is a real trick. Most journalists would call this putting them right down into the bottom of an alley. So going down the alley. You'll see why in a minute. So what happens is you ask them the question, So this guy is in charge. He's not answering the question. He's waffling on about the environment. This is my council tax money that's being spent, I'm thinking. So all the audience will be thinking as well. So I said to him, finally, he's going on and on and on. I said, do you not know? That's the have you stopped beating your wife yet question?
Yeah.
Because you can't actually answer that question. No matter what way you answer it, it's bad. So if he didn't know how much money he was going to save, he should know because he was putting this policy in place. If he did know, why wasn't he telling us? Because it was our money. Now, the interview stopped at that point because he pulled off his microphone and got really upset. But interestingly enough, I finished the interview by turning back to my camera and saying, oh, well, I don't know if we're ever going to find out how much is going to be saved on this or not. 20 minutes later, his office issued the figures.
So you got your answer.
I got my answer in the end. He wasn't happy, and I'm off the Christmas card list as well. Anyway, it's that technique can be used for quite a few things, but it's always when the answer is not forthcoming.
Yes.
You can use it for everything. It doesn't have to be a politician. It could be anything,
The one question that really comes from that is something also that you mentioned earlier, and that's sort of the reverse of asking the same question over and over again to get the answer. It's interrupting to get the answer. BBC is very often criticised for having news presenters and interviewers and journalists who interrupt. Why do journalists interrupt so much?
Well, I don't. That's all I'm going to say to that one. I approach my interviews probably... It's in my own way. We all do it in our own way. So let me just tell you what happens. I ask very short questions. So I'm on the premise of who, what, where, why, how. Yeah?
Okay.
So why did this happen? Who's involved? When will it happen?
How much will it cost?
How's it going to be fixed? How much is it going to cost? That can be used for anything. How are you going to figure this out? What's the end game going to be? So the questions have to be open questions, i.e. questions that they can't respond with yes or no, because you want information. You will hear interviewers who ask very, very long, convoluted questions with all the information in them, and the guest will say yes. Now, that is not an interview. That's you talking at the guest, and that is also a lot of people feel under pressure, actually, especially when you're first starting out with the interview, to show your knowledge. You're not there to show your knowledge. You're there to get the other person to show their knowledge. So I ask very, very short questions. When I interrupt, I do it for a purpose. So it's usually with a politician. It's usually because they're just repeating it. So how do you interrupt? This is a question I get a lot. You have to wait for them to take a breath. Some of them don't take a breath. But you have to get in there and you go, okay, that's great. With respect, you've answered that twice. What I want to know is, yeah?
Okay.
The thing about interrupting is I think it works if you do it at the right place and you're not just doing it to interrupt, if you know what I mean. The thing is also, if you interrupt, it spoils the soundbite. So it could be sort of ruin the interview for everybody else who wants to clip it up and get that little clip and put it in their piece of output. So you have to be quite careful about interrupting. It has its place. It really does have its place. And it can keep the guest under control. You do run the risk of the guest getting, especially if they're very experienced, of getting riled up and actually getting quite, I wouldn't say angry, though some people do get angry, but they get riled up by it, so their voice will get higher, they get a little bit more aggressive. If that ever happens, by the way, never rise to that yourself. If you're doing a normal program, depends on your program. If you're doing an aggressive program, go for it. But if not, in my programs, for instance, I would never do that. I would keep my tone level, and you don't want to rise up or go down. You want to be in the middle of it all. It makes a much better interview. And also, if they do go off on one, you look rather good because you're not. You're very calm and in control.
How do you deal with lies when people lie to you directly?
Lies are difficult unless you know the absolute truth. So if you... Do you remember during the Brexit debates, there was the 350 million that went to the EU every week, and they were going to give it to the NHS?
Absolutely.
Okay, now the thing about that wasn't true. And it was never true from the beginning. And all the organisations were running fact-checking for all things. It's a bit like, you probably heard it with the Trump campaign. There were a lot of fact-checking going on there. Also a lot of lying going on there as well. But every time, if you absolutely know and you can prove it, you're in a really strong position as an interviewer, because you can say, these are the figures, these are where they come from. Are you saying that they're lying? So every time we interviewed someone, we would put this to them, that this is wrong. On the leave side, that this is wrong. This 350 million doesn't exist. That doesn't work like that. And it was really interesting because they used to just keep batting it back. If you have the facts in front of you, you're on solid ground. It goes back to the previous point. You can't make it up. You can't think you heard it in the pub, so it must be true. You have to absolutely know. If you think they're lying and you don't have the information, you have to say, where did you get your information on that? You have to quiz them about the information, And if you can get them, what you really want them to do in that situation is to get them to back it up in a statement, so that if you later find out it's a lie, you can go back to them and you can play that clip again, for instance. Because once it's out there, it's out there. So you have to remain very calm in these situations. There's another thing actually, Davey, about this is when you're in that and it gets a little bit heated, the interviewee starts asking you questions.
Yes.
Now, it's not our role to answer that. I had a colleague who once was asked on air, it was during the whole expenses scandal in Parliament, and then, pay rises for ministers and all of that. It's interesting, these stories tend to be political, isn't it? But one of my colleagues was interviewing someone, and they turned around and asked her about her salary and said, well, what do you earn then? Now, unfortunately, she told him, which wasn't a good thing to do. However, there was a bit of a debate after that as to how could she have handled that in a way that would have batted it straight back and got the interview back on track. It sort of derailed the interview in a way, and she felt quite vulnerable afterwards, because even during the interview, because she realised, I shouldn't have done that. But it just come out as naturally as a person. She had nothing to hide. She said that was fine. But I think what we came to the conclusion on that one was that it would have been better to say something along the lines of, this is not about me, this is about you. Do when these sorts of questions and interview situations, I do remember the first time I interviewed someone, when I finished, it was a terrible interview, but when I finished, my back was sweating, my shirt was stuck to me, I was so nervous. When I look back on that, it's sort of it does shake you a bit when you look back and think, oh my goodness. And yes, of course, with experience, the fear goes away. But in fact, you've got to have, if you're a journalist in the first place, you're a certain sort of person. You've got to have the curiosity, the nosiness, whatever you want to call it. And you've also got to have the balls to do it. So you've got to be really strong, and you've just got to get in there and do it. If you're going to be wishy-washy, there's no point.
So you must be able to manage being a little bit on the rude side with being a little bit on the nice side at the same time, because the last thing you want as an interviewer is to come across as being rude to the interviewee, but you still need to be very firm with them. Oh,
Davey, there's that great phrase, with respect, Minister. Yeah, I tend to, someone once described my interviewing as, killer knife by stealth. Because I do get them. I don't shout, I don't scream, I'm very polite, and I get the answers that I want, and I control the interview. I am in control. And that's the point. When you're just starting out, you feel like you're not in control at all. But in fact, you are in control. They're waiting for you to ask the question. And when you do this the other way around, the interviewee, if they're not terribly experienced, and sometimes even if they are, they do get a bit panicked. And if they're on a mission to give a message and really nothing else, they do get a little bit worried about what the next question is going to be. And I work a lot with various types of people. And if sometimes people are used to being interviewed by a particular journalist. So politicians are normally interviewed by political correspondents or reporters, and they're all steeped in all of that. If you then put that politician in front of a different type of interviewer, so I would say I'm general, I can ask sort of slightly off-the-wall questions that they might not really think about, because I'm not in that bubble. I'm not really in all that minutiae of who said what when. I just want to know the facts in 3 minutes. And that can be quite a dangerous interview from the interviewee's side of things as well. So don't always think that they're on the upper foot.
Have you ever been starstruck?
Doesn't
have to be in the recent 5 or 10 years. It could be going back a little bit.
Yeah, going back a little bit. Well, I was Washington Correspondent from 92 to 96 for GMTV. So I did get to meet a lot of very famous people. The only person I think that I was ever really, really, really starstruck or thought, wow, there is someone with charisma, was Bill Clinton. And he's the most charming person. But he walks into a room and there's, the whole press corps goes to bits. Because he's just very charming and very charismatic. And he's a really good talker as well. But he also makes everybody feel as if you're his friend. Now, that's not particularly good if you're doing an interview. But that was my starstruck moment, I suppose. If you get starstruck by people, you might lose the thread of the interview.
Maxine Mawhinney from the BBC News Channel. In the next edition, I'm going to be talking to another journalist who started her career around about the same time as Maxine, Barbara McCann. Again, the subject will be interviewing. But before I let Maxine away, I wanted to ask her one more question. It's about writing and reading, and importantly, how you go about reading a script that someone else has written.
If I've written it in my voice. Okay? Most of the stuff I read, I don't get the chance to write because of the speed at which we broadcast. So therefore, it's usually written by somebody else. Now, sometimes it's not even written in a voice. It's written as you would write for a newspaper. So it's more for print than for voice. There's a particular skill to writing for voice. When I'm writing it myself, I write really short sentences because you have to think of a few things. Breathing. You will have heard people who don't breathe and go over the full stop and keep going, and then suddenly there's this terrible gasp for air. And the audience don't like that. It's very annoying. And on radio, it's terrible, because they're waiting for the gasp for air or the, smacking of lips or whatever rather than the information. So very short sentences. You can breathe at the full stop. I always say respect the full stop because it's the point at which you can do a lot. You can breathe, you can then change your tone. So, for instance, it's a very grey day here today in London. However, later on they say the sun is going to come out. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
Use the full stop to take the breath and then also change your tone of voice. And you don't, when I'm reading stuff blind. We read stuff blind a lot, so it's not just that someone else has written it. You haven't seen it before. So it comes up and you're almost scanning ahead with your eyes to see what's going on here. So after you've done it for a long time, you get into a pattern of what I would call safe reading.
Sure.
There's like a safe sort of voice of, like I could read anything in this voice and it would sound okay. And then as you see where it's going in the script, you can, and this is all on the auto cue, obviously, you can see it, there's something else is coming out. Maybe you need a bit of emphasis on something. That's okay. There are lots of things about voice as well. So what sort of voice? Again, some of my students would say to me, I sometimes panic and I can't say good afternoon. When I say it, is it good afternoon? Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Yes. And they just go blank and can't say it. Or where do I start the sentence? Is it 27 people have been killed? 27 people have been killed. Or 27 people have been killed. You see? So you can have, using your voice, the voice is really important, and the manner in which you read something is really important, because you can change the tone of that script by reading it inappropriately. So how do you practice that? Well, what I suggest to people usually is, if you're getting stuck on things like good morning, good afternoon, welcome to the program, that sort of stuff, it can throw the rest of the script. So I suggest you practice a few at home and have a little basket in your head of 3 or 4 of them that you know are terribly, terribly safe. And no matter if you go blank completely, you can just pull one of them out. And so you don't have to worry about it. I'm really into safety nets for yourself. Anything that can make things easier so you can just get on with your delivery is perfect. The other thing is to just keep recording your voice and listening to it back. Listening to your voice, even with my TV students, when I get them to do something, I don't let them watch it the first time through. I make them listen to it. Oh. So because if you watch yourself and listen at the same time, you get all carried away with how you look.
Exactly.
So if I don't let them see it, I let them listen to it, and then they can hear the voice, they can hear the delivery style, which is different from the voice. You've got your voice, then you've got the way you use it. Are you breathing properly? Are you keeping a good melody, which is in tune with the story that you're doing? It comes back to tone. And also, are you doing anything really silly, like, lip smacking all the time or whatever? And then I show it to them. But listening to the voice is really important for learning, especially when you're starting out. So if you can record yourself and listen, record yourself reading the newspaper, it doesn't matter what it is. Just do it and keep listening and listening and listening. And then you will get your own voice. You will get your voice. People get really worried about their voice. And most people say to me, I hate my voice. Well, get over it. It's your voice. So if you want to use it, there are various ways you can practice. There's also an issue with particularly women who can get really high.
Yes.
Really excited. So you need to bring them down low. And for that, you can use a Pringles box. And this is brilliant because you can eat the crisps afterwards. This is the best ever. So what you do is you take the crisps out of the Pringles box and put them in a bowl to one side. And you put the Pringles box over your nose and mouth, almost like, the tube. And you keep talking till you lower your voice, lower your voice, lower your voice, lower your voice. And you can feel it then in your, in the bones, in your bones of your face. And you just keep talking like that. Take the Pringles box away and then try your script again. If you're a girl and you're going high. And you'll be much lower. It really works. And then you eat crisps, which is fabulous. What can also happen is when people are in front of a camera or a microphone or both, they become a little diminished, as in, let me give you an example. Let's see. Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to BBC News. Now, if I did that on TV, I'd just look completely diminished. Hello, good afternoon, welcome to BBC News. So there's a big difference between those two types of delivery. The second one is energetic. It's got interest in it. And I also do the little beat thing on the full stop and change my voice. You can have the best information in the world and ruin it by bad delivery. And you can make really rubbish information sound fabulous. Doing it the other way around.
This is the Podcasting for podcast. You can find out more and subscribe at podcasting4.com and hear other interviews with radio presenters and journalists about the skills of the trade. Subscribe now and get all episodes delivered to you automatically. Podcasting4.com. I'm Davey Sims. And a final word of thanks to the Blue Dot Sessions who provide the music for this podcast. You can find this track, Downhill Racer, and lots of others at freemusicarchive.org.